Welcome to the Creating Space podcast. My name is Olivia Lancashire, and as a part of my undergraduate research with the Lumen Prize at Elon University, I'm going to be conducting a series of interviews that will explore my current project, the intersection between Christian perspectives on hell and religious trauma. In this podcast series, I will be interviewing individuals from a range of expertise, including pastors, counselors, biblical scholars, and psychologists. In doing so, I hope to create a space for questions that a lot of people are too afraid to talk about. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Meghan Henning, a leading scholar in religious studies and the author of Hell Hath No Fury, which explores gender, disability, and the invention of damned bodies in early Christian literature. Dr. Henning is an associate professor of Christian origins at the University of Dayton. She specializes in New Testament and early Christianity and holds a master's degree in biblical studies from Yale Divinity School and a doctorate in New Testament from Emory University. Dr. Henning explores the intricate evolution of the concept of hell across ancient Mediterranean cultures and literature, examining its profound impact on modern societal issues, including power dynamics and gender. Join us as we dive into her groundbreaking research, the historical and contemporary implications of hell, and her insights on navigating these complex themes today. Welcome, Dr. Henning.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Olivia.
I'm so excited to have you. So, can you tell us a little bit about your past research and what initially inspired you to explore this area, particularly the concept of hell?
Sure. So I have been thinking about and writing about hell since 2011 when I started writing my first book, which was my dissertation that I turned into a book and published there. And that project was really, I got interested in the research topic going backwards when I was probably, I wouldn't have said that I was interested in hell, but I was interested specifically in biblical language around bodily suffering. And the way that people can be reading the same biblical text, and some people can interpret it in ways that are really helpful for people who are experiencing pain and trauma today, and some people can interpret that same text in the same context in ways that can actually make it harder for people who are experiencing trauma. And so I really, at an early age, because of some trauma that my own family experienced, I was interested in questions around what to do with interpretation. I didn't know the word hermeneutics yet, but I was asking questions about hermeneutics. Why do we interpret passages the way that we do, and when can we make different interpretive decisions that might mitigate the harm that can be done by violent language that's in our biblical text? There's a lot of violence in the biblical text, and we need to handle that text with care because it is really powerful. Precisely because it is seen as having authority by a large number of religious communities. So I was in high school, and my do you want the long answer or the short answer? I should have asked that first. Okay. So I was in high school, and my grandfather was dying of lung cancer. And my grandmother was caring for him around the clock. And I come from an Italian family, so she was making all of his favorite foods and making sure that he was comfortable. And that's a very Italian grandmother thing to do. And when the nurses and doctors told her in the hospital that it was time for him to go home for hospice care and that he would be dying soon, she waited until he fell asleep so that he wouldn't be alone in the hospital. And then she drove her car to the grocery store at 4 a.m. And filled it with all the things that she would need to make all of my grandfather's favorite meals for his last 2 weeks of life. And she had not been sleeping for many months because of the way that she was caring for him. And so she fell asleep at the wheel of her car, and she ran her car into a telephone pole. And she sustained major internal injuries, and one of her legs was amputated. She was in a coma for several months. And while she was in the coma, my grandfather died 10 days after the car accident. And 6 months after the car accident, my father lost his job. So my mom, who had one parent in a coma, one parent in dying and then her spouse losing his job in rapid succession, was going through a lot, to say the least, right? Our family was dealing with a lot. And we were part of a wonderful Lutheran church in Northeastern Ohio, a Sunday school class where people really rallied around my family that my parents were really close to. But people could be reading the exact same biblical text, and one person would say something that was extremely helpful, and another might say something that implied that somehow the things that my family was experiencing were our fault or the result of a lack of faith. And that was devastating when that happened. And that really oddly drew me to the biblical text more rather than the opposite. I found myself wanting to know more and wanting to understand more. That's how I became a biblical scholar, and that those questions deepened through my study. But I've really never left those questions. And so it was actually when I was sitting in a class in graduate school, reading a book by a famous German theologian, Rudolf Bultmann. He has a chapter that's not about hell at all. It's about the Gospels and the kind of central message of the early church. And there's a little short section of that chapter where he talks about the hell passages in the New Testament and says that they really aren't the central message of the early church, and they're solely coming from the culture around the church, and so they're really not the thing that we need to focus on here. And then he kind of moves on and never says anything about it in the rest of his 700-page book. And that kind of gap in the text, that like we're going to deal with it and then we're going to move on and we're not going to say anything about it, really sparked my curiosity. And it was that day when I read that I was like, I need to know more, because that answer is not satisfying to me. And essentially a version of that answer was what had been written in most of the books about hell that existed to that point, with maybe one or two exceptions. And so I really needed to know more about how we got this idea, what it's doing in the New Testament documents, and how we can think about it and interpret it today.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's so helpful to hear how your personal story kind of drove your motivation into working on this topic. And I think it's so important and healing for other people too that have been hurt by poor interpretations of the text. And so I think the work that you're doing is so powerful and necessary so that people can experience healing from maybe some of those bad experiences with poor interpretation. So yeah, I wanted to talk about your Bible Odyssey article because this blew my mind when I read this. It was the craziest thing ever, and I was so excited when I read it. But you mentioned different Greek and Hebrew words that translate into the English word hell. Can you talk about those terms and kind of the implications that they have about how we understand hell today?
Sure, of course. Yeah. So there are different words, namely the word Gehenna and the word Hades are the two big ones that are the Greek words that get translated as hell in New Testament texts. But it's difficult to render them because even though they are different words, it seems as though, from my perspective and reading the other literature around this time, that although they started as probably conceptually distinctive ideas, by the time the early Christians are writing the texts that we call the New Testament today, those words probably started to have overlap in meaning. And people were probably imagining similar concepts by that point. And that's because, so Gehenna refers to a valley, a literal valley, but it had come to, by the 1st century CE, be associated with fire and context of judgment, because it is referred to in a Jewish apocalypse called First Enoch. And so people were starting to meld different ideas of an actual place with a place of fire and judgment, or at least separation. And and value judgments about righteousness and unrighteousness. And then Hades is also a little bit tricky because in a Greek context or a Roman context, it does refer to an afterlife space where everybody goes after they die. But in those contexts, there are sometimes punishments for particular people, particularly people who have offended the gods in some personal way. But not everybody in Hades is being punished, but everyone in Hades does agree that it would be better to be alive than to be in Hades. For the most part, that is it. And then Hades, though, is also the Greek word that is translating in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew word Sheol. So the Hebrew word Sheol refers to a place that I would kind of say is neutral. Like it's not a good place, but it's where everybody goes after they die, and it's not associated in any strong way with judgment or punishment. And so that's where the New Testament texts are a bit tricky, because these authors, the earliest Christians are Jewish, and so are they imagining something like, when they use the word Hades, are they imagining something like Sheol? Or are they imagining something like Roman ideas of Hades? Or is it something new altogether where these terms are starting to get blended together in different ways? And I think it's the last thing. I think it's probably that that by this point, the idea is in development. And so that's what is interesting, is that when we're reading New Testament texts that use these words, we're actually joining an already in progress conversation. And different people in the audience might have imagined slightly different things, but they are starting to associate these ideas with the idea of judgment and punishment in this period.
Interesting. Okay, so it seems like in our modern understanding of hell, in mainstream evangelical spheres, we imagine hell as a place of punishment with fire, and we see those images. Can you talk about like how that has evolved over time, like how we got there, and maybe how we can deal with that version of hell, if that makes sense?
So the fire, where does the fire come in? So the fire comes in apocalyptic context, but we see it already in New Testament like text. So we don't have specific images of hell that are really like elaborate, with the exception of the story in Luke with the rich man and Lazarus, where there's fire, there's a personal, these people know each other. It's not even anonymous like some of our later visions of hell. So the idea of fire by this point, by the 1st century, is already attached, I think, to these ideas that, but it's not elaborated in the same way that the texts that we get in the 2nd century forward have a lot more intense depictions of the place as being extremely fiery, and the torments being described in greater detail. So the earlier references are sort of shorter things, like the weeping and gnashing of teeth. That, I mean, there's no question that this is a place of punishment. And one of the things that I discovered in the 2nd book project is that these spaces are being described in the 1st century and beyond, in the tours of hell as well, as places that really would have resonated with Roman technologies of punishment. So one of them, and specifically Roman technologies of punishment that would have been reserved for the lowest status members of that society. So one of the worst sentences that you could get in the ancient world was condemnation to the mines. And it was a punishment that was really for non-elites. If you were what would be called in the Roman world an onestiore, an elite member of society, you would be able to be beheaded if you had committed a crime. But this condemnation to the underground mines, and later Christian thinkers even explicitly comment on this, like John Chrysostom talks about how hell is worse than the mines. It's like the mines, but only worse. So we know that Christians are explicitly actually making this connection, and probably in an earlier period are implicitly doing so. And the mines would have been dark, they would have been cold, sometimes they would have been extremely hot, depending, like there was no temperature control, right?
Yeah.
And we also know that they were extremely dirty. There were no bathroom facilities that were separate from the mines, so they were filled with human excrement that you could smell throughout. And people who were working in the mines were prone to contracting diseases or additional disabilities while they were there. So these spaces were designed to have long-term negative impacts on the body, and they were notorious as a form of punishment that was underground, and that had these kind of extreme temperatures, and that would have resulted in sweating, crying, gnashing your teeth, those kinds of things that are described in images of hell. So that's one of the things that I think part of where we get any single concept of punishment or torture that we have in those texts is really tightly connected to the justice system of the ancient world. And so one of the things I think people don't realize when they talk about hell today is that they are unintentionally calling up a punitive justice system from thousands of years ago in those images.
Yeah. Wow. That is so interesting. So as we think about the prison system that they use, or the punishment system, just to clarify for myself, are you kind of saying that that system really influenced the authors of the New Testament in their writing about the afterlife?
Yeah, I think that I think everything from their culture
Yeah.
influenced their reading about the afterlife, right? So I think that they are imagining, like, so for example, when there's the lake of fire in the book of Revelation, that's a punishment that that I think absolutely draws upon images from the surrounding world, and it is connecting to the ideas in other ancient texts from the broader culture of the Lake of Avernus, but it's also known that there are sulfurous bodies of water right nearby that would have also evoked people's imaginations. So I think that there are a wide range of things that people might have called up in their mind when they heard these stories, but because they're explicitly associated with punishment, I think that the prison context was one that was close at hand. And then we know from later church fathers who are talking, not in the tours of hell themselves, but actually talking about the idea of hell that's represented in those texts, like Augustine, right? He talks about how the system of eternal justice and punishment has to match has to be at least as good as what Cicero describes. Right, in the Roman world. So later Christians, whether or not the New Testament authors were confident that their hearers were going to think about the mines every time, I think it was definitely one of the rhetorical moves that they could expect that a lot of the people in the audience would think about that. And then I think that becomes solidified as we get more and more specific depictions of hell that look more and more like Roman mechanisms of punishment, not just the mines, but other mechanisms of torture, that this justice system that's built on the idea of lex talionis, that the punishment should fit the crime, the idea of there not being mercy, and that would be an appropriate deterrent for particular kinds of behaviors, that that this was a thing that was tied tightly to social class and that marginalized further the people who had to live out these particular punishments. That those things are intensified and made even more intense than they are in the real world, and explicitly so by later Christian authors.
Okay, that makes sense. And then I know you said that we kind of see more intense depictions of punishment and torture as we go through the literature. And in your book, Hell Hath No Fury, you talk a lot about the tours of hell. Can you explain for people that don't know what that is and how that might influence our modern understanding?
Yes. So when I talk to people about this, most of them have never heard of the tours of hell that I'm talking about, like the Apocalypse of Peter or the Apocalypse of Paul or the Apocalypse of Mary, which are some of the more popular ones where we have a lot of evidence. The Apocalypse of Peter is one of the earliest, and the others are probably building on and responding to that text in some way and changing around the sins and the punishments in response. But even though we've never heard of those texts and we might not have encountered those, though you can get access to them relatively easily, you can read them in translation on your computer, no problem, now that you know that they exist. The Apocalypse of Paul, Dante says that most people have heard of Dante's Inferno.
Yeah.
And Dante, when he is writing the Inferno, in the very first section says, I just read the vision of Paul. And so he refers to having read the Apocalypse of Paul, which was a widely popular text during the period in which he's writing. And he creates his own vision of hell that is different from the Apocalypse of Paul, but it is similar in that it uses and relies upon some of the same ideas about the body and justice that we see in those earlier tours of hell. And so because of the popularity of Dante's Inferno, especially in Western contexts, I think that the legacy of the apocalypses that describe these tours of hell is much longer than we would have expected for texts that we've never heard about, right? So the dominant idea of hell that people have when they think about it is not Matthew 25 and the sheep and the goats, or the weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's the images from these tours of hell that Dante brought forward to the present.
Interesting. Yeah. And I when I first learned about that, I was also blown away because I was so shocked that I hadn't learned about this in a church setting, yet it had impacted my version of hell so much. And I think even you talk about this too, like popular culture and The Good Place, for example, influencing our idea of this dichotomy of heaven versus hell and what punishments there are going to be. I think that's so interesting, and more people, I hope for more people to know about that.
That's one of the interesting things, is that you realize how widely the cultural information is when you watch a show like The Good Place, because there's a lot that they don't have to explain.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody watching this show or they're assuming, and they were successful, it was a widely popular show, right?
Yeah.
They could assume that everyone watching this show would know about an idea of hell that was based on tortures, and in particular, really precise tortures that were targeted to specific people based on the things that they did in their life. And that's a very specific idea of hell that comes from a very particular place, but it has become, especially in North America, this dominant vision. So I'm curious, when you say that you had these ideas of hell and you didn't realize they came from Dante, like, was hell described to you? Were people telling you, like, because it's not in the biblical text, right? The long descriptions are really not there. So where did it come from? How did you encounter it? Or do you think you had just imagined it yourself based on cultural information?
You know, I don't remember a time when it was ever really described to me. I think one of my first real encounters with it was I went to this small group and they asked me, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to go to heaven if you died today? And so, you know, that obviously scared me and brought a lot of anxiety, but it wasn't explained what hell was. I think I just had this idea that it was a place I, one, did not want to go, and two, a place of anxiety and punishment. And I had that fiery vision in my head, but I didn't know where it came from. So I think it truly, our idea of hell is so shaped by culture around us without even realizing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the idea of you're in a social context like that. So it also implies that different people in the room will have different answers to that question. And so you might be separated from people that you care a great deal about.
Yes.
Based on your answer to that question.
Yeah. Okay, so also kind of staying on the lines of tours of hell, can you talk about how that might shape social and power dynamics in our larger society, but also maybe in church context too, and like hierarchical structures maybe?
Yeah, sorry, can you say the first part of the question again?
Yeah, just kind of looking at how the tours of hell and those specific punishments that we're seeing, how they shape various social and power dynamics and hierarchy.
Yeah, they are drawing explicitly from social hierarchies in their own world. So the very earliest one of these texts, the Apocalypse of Peter, the order of the punishments and the way in which those punishments are gendered and tied to social class, like enslavement, follows something called the ancient Roman household codes. And the household codes were an understanding in Roman society about how you should hierarchically order not just your household, but your household in relationship to the broader society, so that the city-state or the polis would be like in perfect sync and in perfect order. And so the hierarchy there is that we see replicated is sort of focused on relationships in the household, but then this gets expanded in later tours of hell to include church leadership, to include different classes of, and of course these are later texts, so there's more levels of church hierarchy as we go forward in the future that needs to be mentioned. So when we get to the Greek Apocalypse of Mary, you've got a whole bunch of different categories of leaders that are being called out if they're not taking care of the poor or taking care of the widows in their community, or abusing their power in some way. And so you have both a focus on reproducing the hierarchy of the world in hell, and then you also have an undermining of abuse of power. And and so if we have this system of hierarchy, we also have these then punishments in hell that really debase people and bring them low if they have not used their power judiciously or to live out the virtues of the Sermon on the Mount in their life on earth. And so some of these texts are actually written for elites in order to reinforce ethical messaging around how they are supposed to be in Christian communities, caring for the marginalized among themselves. And that's one of the things that's really strange, is that these texts are very focused on care for the marginalized other, but they're bringing in technologies of punishment that reinforce ideas of gender and disability and ethnic difference and race and antiquity and class that further marginalize and make the stakes for those marginalized bodies much higher and have eternal significance. And so hell can reinforce or even bring to the present the social hierarchies of the ancient world, which it seems to actually be at cross purposes with some of the explicit ethical messaging of those texts.
Wow, that's so interesting. And it seems like maybe in our Western world, in maybe evangelical, maybe higher control religions, there is, it seems, a certain population that is maybe favored, I guess. If you are doing X, Y, and Z and you stay in this lane, then you have the ultimate position in our church, or you are doing things right, or you are saved. Does that kind of seem like it might be influenced by also those hierarchies and power dynamics?
I think that one of the things that is helpful to think about here is that there is a benefit
Mhm.
if you want to create a social hierarchy. Many people are implicitly drawing on this ancient tradition when they do.
Yes.
So, and it's in a text that is deemed authoritative, right? So the household codes are replicated in several texts in the New Testament. So um, you will see many fundamentalist Christian groups in North America um, hearkening to gender hierarchy that matches what you see in the Roman household codes, whether they're aware that that comes from Roman society or not, right?
Right.
They might see it simply as a biblical organization of
Yeah.
one's household, not realizing where it has come from, and or sometimes it's very explicit.
Yeah.
This is drawing on Aristotle, and they say that, but it's not always the case that it is made explicit. It's sometimes, like you said, more implicit, where it's like, well, these are the people who are super spiritual, and they've done all of these things, and yeah. And I also think it's very interesting to look at where it maps onto wealth. So I talked a little bit about elite status and how certain punishments were tied to certain classes in antiquity, and we've brought forward in these texts this kind of punishment system, not realizing those things that it was tied to. Um, but sometimes that same class structure gets recreated in churches as well, and so I think that's one of the values of paying attention to where these ideas are coming from and where they are culturally grounded in the ancient world, because it allows us to make concrete decisions and conscious decisions about um, what is meaningful for today and what no longer serves us.
Yeah.
So I think that because these texts that I'm reading are really intensifying the both with respect to the violence, but also just the eternal stakes of these things, they can become a very dangerous and powerful tool rhetorically. And so I think that's why people still use hell language today. I think that they're aware that it has persuasive power, and they're maybe not aware of some of the things that come with it.
Yeah. That makes sense. And then for anyone who might be struggling with this popular depiction of hell as a place of punishment and torture, is there any piece of advice that you would recommend or any direction you would send them in if they want to look at this from a more academic lens?
Well, I think that when you have a question that you really feel deeply, um, I think that there is nothing um, more appropriate than to follow that question.
Mhm.
I think that I ask my students at the end of every class to go forth and lean into the uncertainty. And I teach in a religious and explicitly religious context. I teach at a Catholic university, but part of the Catholic intellectual tradition, part of my own faith as a member of a United Church of Christ, is to look out for God revealing God's self to us in history in new ways. And the only way we could find that, the only way we could see that, is if we do open ourselves up to the uncertainty and allow God to speak to us today. And so I don't think that these texts are static. I don't think that God is static. And I think that the very act of, or if you're not a person of faith, there's still tremendous value in asking these questions and how we can care for each other better in our world, while understanding the the tremendous importance of these texts for people of faith, as
Yeah.
well as the different ways that they can be interpreted and read faithfully today. So I think that there are a lot of different answers to the questions that can bring value. And I also think that the act of listening to and honoring your own questions is in itself one of the most valuable things that we can do as learners and as people.
Yeah. Wow, I love that. And I think that's so important for people to hear, especially if people have been hurt by interpretations that have been imposed onto them, because I think, everyone is seeking some sort of connection to the divine, whatever that looks like for them, even if they might not be on that journey yet. I think that's kind of innate in the human self. And so I think it's so cool to hear how you've been on this academic journey and you've also been able to engage with faith in a way that still honors your questions and lets you explore and be you, but also lets you engage in the tradition. And I think for people that might have grown up in more fundamentalist environments, it's cool to hear different perspectives that they can learn about and see that there's not just one way and it doesn't have to be so black and white. So that's really powerful, I think, for people to hear. And then my last question, I just wanted to ask you about any future research directions that you might be going or taking this topic, because I know you've done so much work with it. So I want to know what you're thinking.
Well, I am working on a project on ancient apocalypticism for Cambridge University Press for their Element series. That's going to be a shorter book. And then I'm working, and they're thinking more about apocalyptic literature broadly. So it will include hell, but not just be about hell. But I'm also working right now on a project on prayer and the body and the mind, and thinking about the ways in which mental disabilities and the way that we think about minds and bodies are related to our understanding of spirituality, and really thinking about ways in which a disability studies framework or a cultural history of those prayer passages in the New Testament can help us recover tools that already are in the religious past for thinking about spirituality in more holistic ways. So not hell. I'm trying to get out of hell for a little bit, but we'll see if we can actually do it. It's not easy. But I am thinking specifically about the same question of how have some of the ways that we have thought about prayer not been helpful and have actually been hurtful to people. So
wow,
similar set of questions. Yeah.
Well, I'm so excited to eventually read that. That will be so awesome. I appreciate you coming on today and answering all of the questions that I had. I think this is going to be so helpful for people that are exploring this topic more in depth. So I appreciate it.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you for doing this series. I agree. I think that these podcasts are going to be a wonderful resource for folks, whether or not mine is, but I think the whole topic is really important, and I'm glad you're looking at it from so many different perspectives. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I appreciate it.